So this is, what book number, because this is at least 2, because you did the story of English.
Story of English, yes. That was in the 80s. And that came out in 86. I'm astonished to say. It's 25 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like that.
I know. And that was with Robert McNeill, the distinguished Canadian. And really, ever since then, I've been sort of writing this book in my head. Because when we finished, there was some unfinished business and about the future of the language, and particularly its global dimension. We'd covered it, but we hadn't really covered it in much. We hadn't really thought about it. We hadn't thought it all through. And at that point, in the late 80s, people were saying, "Oh, well, English is going to break out like Latin into mutually unintelligible varieties, like Italian, Spanish, and so on." And there was some evidence this was true. If you looked at Jamaican English and Singaporean English and Indian English, but actually, that hasn't happened. In fact, the reverse has happened. So everything's got closer together. There's now more international communication through Globish, what I'm calling Globish, than ever before.
Well, it's just as easy to talk to a Jamaican cab driver on the internet as it is to a South African pool player. You're as communication has become simpler, it's just as easy to do that as just literally to the cubicle next door. So
yes. So why not? Yes, and I think the internet has played a huge. I think the internet is still predominantly English. Obviously, there's Chinese and there's Spanish and Arabic, but it's still predominantly English, and it's what people turn to. If you're a Japanese and you're stuck to communicate with, say, a Hungarian or a Finn or a Turk, it's easier to switch to this than to anything else.
One of my favorite lines in the book. English has always had this subversive capacity to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, to articulate the ideas of both government and opposition, to be the language of ordinary people as well as the language of power and authority, rock and roll, and royal decree.
Yeah, it's always been belongs to everyone. There's another book which I'm very fond of, which is a remark or a preface that Walt Whitman, the American poet, wrote. I quote here: "The English language is not an abstract construction of dictionary makers. It is the powerful language of resistance. It is the dialect of common sense. It is the speech of the proud and of all who aspire." And this is the key bit. And it has its basis broad and low, close to the ground. So it's really, it belongs to the ordinary. It belongs to you and me, and doesn't belong to fancy people. It belongs to every man. It always has done.
I kept waiting in the book for the big moment, and there isn't one. There isn't a big moment in which it becomes ascendant. It just kind of...
It evolves. The language change is very slow. That's the point of it. It is very, very slow. It takes place over hundreds of years. And so there wasn't a kind of... I had a kind of eureka moment when I came across the word Globish, but you can't say from this point. Well, you can say the American Revolution. That was a high point. The American Revolution, July 1776. That's a real turning point in hindsight. But since then, there really haven't been many turning points, to be honest. Although the fall of the wall, I think the fall of the wall is very important for this story, because during the 1990s, and during the last 10 years or so, with the end of the Soviet Union, with the rise of global capitalism and the spread of the internet, you've got all these forces coming together to give the language a whole new perspective and a whole new trajectory, which is a 21st century one, and we're one which is sort of broken free from the colonial and the imperial past.
Globish itself, can you speak it, and what does it sound like? Because it doesn't sound like this.
No, it doesn't sound like this. And one of my anxieties when I've been doing talks about this book is people say, "Give us an example," and I'm inclined to say, well, you've heard it in airports. It's an imperfect version of the way we're speaking, with full of mistakes, but nonetheless conveying meaning. And it's not Pidgin English. So, somebody was on the radio today was saying it's not Pidgin. Pidgin is something else. But it's highly simplified. It's grammatically often incorrect, but it does convey meaning. So it's useful for international communication. And if a Korean and a Hungarian meet and get into difficulties, or a Chilean gets into a taxi to go to a football match in South Africa driven by a Zulu with a Uruguayan, they're likely to default into Globish, because it's the one thing they'll have in common. So it does sort of promote, I think, international communication, or maybe international harmony. So maybe it's a good thing. I don't know.
Because you kind of end with the Tower of Babel, where speaking that language wasn't such a good thing, and understanding didn't stop us from having the First World War.
No, of course not. And the Tower of, we say Babel, Babel, is still with us in many, many ways. And I think that's good. I think we want to have a variety, a patchwork of mother tongues. And this is not going to change that. Globish, it won't change that. It's not going to make our English work. We're going to be losers, because I look at my children. When I was growing up, we were learning English, French, German, Italian. There's a range of languages. I think the same is true for Americans. If you go to Europe, you'll hear Europeans switching in and out to different languages. Nowadays, if you're an Anglophone, you don't need to have that menu. It's part of your kind of cultural baggage. So there's a loss there.
Given the current deficits of both the United States and Britain, that you may be speaking Canadian.
I may be speaking Canadian or Chinese.
It's a really fun book, and lots of really neat stuff about the language that a lot of us were born speaking and really don't appreciate the value of at times.
Thank you very much.
The book is Globish, How the English Language Became the World's Language. I've been speaking with the author Robert McCrum, and Globish is published by Doubleday Canada.